Welcome to our channel, where exciting and inspiring stories come to life. Here, you will find stories of overcoming, surprising twists and lessons that touch the heart. We believe in the power of stories to transform perspectives. If you like good stories, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and activate the notification bell so you never miss our releases. And of course, share your opinions in the comments. We want to hear from you and how we can continue to bring you even more exciting stories.
Ethan Caldwell stood in his office, the early morning sunlight filtering through the vast windows that stretched from floor to ceiling. Los Angeles pulsed below him, a city that never slept, where ambition ruled and power games were a daily ritual. Ethan knew this world well. At 35, he had earned his reputation as a shrewd businessman with an impeccable record. The Caldwell name was synonymous with success, built over decades by his father, Charles Caldwell, who had created an empire with iron determination. But even empires had vulnerabilities. For months, the whispers in boardrooms had grown louder. Ethan needed stability, a personal life that reflected the maturity required to lead the corporation into its next era. His father's failing health only intensified the pressure. Charles, ever the imposing patriarch, had made it clear that without a clear sign of commitment, a partner, a fiancée, Ethan's ascension to CEO would remain uncertain. Ethan's jaw clenched as he looked out over the urban landscape. The board's ultimatum replayed in his mind, mingled with the stern warnings of his father. The stakes were higher than ever, and the weight of expectation pressed down like a vice. He turned away from the window, irritation simmering beneath his composed exterior. Marrying for convenience was out of the question. Love, to Ethan, was a distraction, an unpredictable variable he neither desired nor trusted. But an idea, a compromise, flickered to life. A partnership of convenience, scripted and temporary, might just buy him time and appease the powers that be. Later that day, Ethan found himself in the chaos of downtown Los Angeles, where polished skyscrapers cast long shadows over bustling streets. He entered a quaint cafe, the Roasted Bean, nestled between modern buildings as if stubbornly holding on to its old charm. The aroma of coffee and freshly baked pastries wrapped around him as he crossed the threshold, his expensive suit contrasting sharply with the rustic interior and the flannel-clad patrons scattered at tables. Mia Thompson moved through the cafe with practiced grace, balancing a tray of steaming mugs. She was used to the unpredictable rush of morning customers and the tight smiles exchanged over counter orders. Her long chestnut hair was pulled back in a loose ponytail, a few rebellious strands framing her face. Mia's life was a constant battle between dreams and reality. During the day, she served coffee and handled impatient customers. At night, she worked on sketches and paintings in her tiny East LA apartment, hoping one day to show them in a gallery. But hope, she often reminded herself, didn't pay rent or buy food. When she glanced at the man who had just entered, her breath caught for a moment. He stood out with an aura of confidence that bordered on arrogance. His suit was tailored, the dark fabric cutting a sharp silhouette against the warm, amber light of the cafe. He scanned the room as if assessing its worth before taking a seat at the corner table. Mia didn't have time to wonder why someone like him would be here. She approached his table, the familiar strain of balancing customer service with politeness settling over her like a second skin. "Good morning. What can I get for you?" she asked, her voice steady, eyes meeting his with polite detachment. Ethan looked up and saw a young woman with eyes as deep as a summer lake, calm yet holding a trace of defiance. She was nothing like the people in his world, people who laughed too loudly at parties and wielded power like a weapon. He felt an odd curiosity, "A black coffee. No sugar," he replied, his tone clipped but not unkind. Mia nodded and moved back to the counter. As she prepared his coffee, she overheard two customers discussing the upcoming gallery event downtown. The mention made her heart twinge with longing. She had submitted her portfolio to dozens of places, hoping to find a foothold in the competitive art scene, but the replies had been scarce and never favorable. Returning to the table, she placed the cup down carefully. "Here you go," she said, glancing briefly at his expression, which seemed distant, as though he were working out some complicated equation in his head. Ethan sipped the coffee, its bitterness a familiar comfort. As he watched the activity in the cafe, a thought began to crystallize. He needed someone different, someone real, someone who wouldn't pose the complications of familiarity with his world. The idea had seemed impossible when it first formed, but now, with the energy of this busy cafe around him and the sight of this capable, grounded woman serving coffee, the pieces of his plan started to fit. He caught Mia's attention just as she was turning to leave. "Excuse me," he said. She paused, a hint of surprise crossing her features before she nodded for him to continue. "I have a proposition for you. One that might seem unusual." Mia blinked, trying to decipher the shift in his expression. "A proposition?" she echoed, her voice careful. "Yes," Ethan said, leaning slightly forward. "I need someone to act as my fiancée for a month. In exchange, you'll be well compensated, enough to take a significant step toward whatever it is you're aiming for." His eyes flicked to her calloused fingers, faint smudges of paint visible near her nails, and back to her eyes. "I can tell you have aspirations." The room seemed to shrink as Mia took in his words, the din of the cafe muffled by the thundering of her heart. She wasn't sure whether to laugh or walk away. The very idea was absurd, but she couldn't deny the spark of intrigue, mingled with a glimmer of hope that this might be her chance. A chance to finally move beyond the endless cycle of survival. "That's quite an offer," she managed, her throat dry. "And why me, of all people?" Ethan's gaze softened, just a fraction, enough to reveal a man calculating yet not devoid of insight. "Because you're different from everyone I know. And that's exactly what I need." Mia hesitated, the weight of her responsibilities warring with the reckless urge to say yes. This man was clearly wealthy, powerful, the kind of person who could make good on a promise as outlandish as the one he'd just proposed. But trust didn't come easily to her. "Give me some time to think about it," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan nodded, taking it as a sign of cautious optimism. "Think about it, and let me know. But don't take too long. Time, after all, is money." With that, he finished his coffee, stood, and left the cafe, leaving Mia standing by the table, questions spinning like leaves caught in a whirlwind. As she watched him disappear into the sun-drenched street, Mia felt the tremor of something unexpected. The city roared on around her, but for the first time in a long while, it felt as if her life was on the cusp of change, pulled between the familiar chaos and a choice that could redefine everything. The evening sun bathed Los Angeles in hues of orange and deep purple, casting long shadows across the crowded streets. Mia stood by the large, smudged window of her apartment, her mind racing. The room around her was a chaotic mix of canvases, art supplies, and half-finished paintings, each one a testament to the dreams she hadn't quite managed to realize. Ethan Caldwell's proposition echoed in her thoughts, a strange blend of absurdity and opportunity that she couldn't shake. Mia's phone buzzed on the cluttered table, startling her out of her trance. She glanced at the screen. Her best friend, Rachel, was calling. Rachel was the one person who knew the depths of Mia's struggles, from late-night talks about unpaid rent to comforting her after gallery rejections. "Hey," Mia answered, trying to sound casual, though the weight of Ethan's offer still pressed on her chest. "Hey, are you okay? You sound weird." Rachel's voice was bright but tinged with concern. She could always read Mia, even through the phone. "Yeah, Just had a strange day, Mia replied, eyes wandering over her most recent painting, a cityscape with bold strokes of blue and gray. It felt incomplete, much like her life. Oh, care to elaborate? Rachel prompted, with the subtle nosiness of a friend who wouldn't let it drop. Mia hesitated, unsure how to frame what had happened without sounding insane. I got an offer today from someone at the cafe. An offer? Rachel's tone shifted, the playful curiosity replaced by genuine interest. What kind of offer? Not one of those creepy ones, I hope. No, not like that. Mia sat down on the edge of her small couch, tucking her legs beneath her. It was from this guy. A businessman, I think. Super rich. He wants me to pretend to be his fiancée for a month. A silence stretched over the line, so long that Mia wondered if the call had dropped. Are you serious? Rachel's voice finally came, incredulous. Mia, that's... what even? Why would he ask you to do that? He said it's for appearances. Something about needing to prove to his company and his father that he's ready for the next step. Mia's own words felt unreal, like she was recounting someone else's story. Wow, and you're considering this? Rachel's skepticism was clear, but so was the glimmer of hope in her voice. She knew how much Mia needed a break. I don't know. I mean, it's crazy, right? But the money could help me pay off the debts, get a better space for painting. Maybe even finally get into a gallery, Mia said, her voice trailing off as she envisioned what even a fraction of Ethan's promised compensation could mean. Rachel sighed. Yeah, it's crazy, but maybe it's the kind of crazy you need right now. Just be careful, okay? These kinds of deals don't come without strings. I will, Mia promised, though the pit of uncertainty in her stomach didn't ease. The next morning, the crisp, golden light poured into the cafe as Mia stepped behind the counter, nerves tingling in anticipation. The usual customers trickled in. The office workers, the students, the elderly couple who always shared a scone. But she only had eyes for the door, waiting to see if Ethan would return, half hoping he wouldn't. The reality of what she was considering felt too big, too strange. Half an hour into her shift, the bell above the door chimed. Mia looked up, her heart lurching as Ethan stepped inside, as impeccably dressed as before. His presence seemed to command the attention of the room, though most people were too busy with their routines to notice. He approached the counter, his gaze meeting hers with a mix of anticipation and calm control. "Good morning, Miss Thompson," he said, the faintest trace of a smile on his lips. "Have you thought about my offer?" Mia swallowed, glancing around to make sure her co-workers were out of earshot. "I have," she said, leaning slightly forward. "It's unconventional, to say the least." Ethan nodded, as though her hesitation were expected. "It is. But sometimes unconventional solutions are the most effective." She bit her lip, the weight of her decision pressing down like a physical force. "If I say yes, I have conditions." "Of course," he said smoothly. "Let's discuss them. Can you step out for a break?" Mia signaled to her manager, who waved her off, and led Ethan to the small park across the street. The noise of traffic and the chatter of pedestrians provided a buffer for their conversation. They sat on a bench, the morning chill sharp but invigorating. "All right," Mia began, wrapping her arms around herself more for comfort than warmth. "If I agree, I need a contract. Something legally binding that outlines exactly what's expected of me, and what happens if things go south." Ethan's eyes gleamed with approval. "Smart. I wouldn't expect anything less. We can have my lawyer draft a formal agreement by the end of the day." And Mia continued, her voice firmer, "No physical obligations. This is strictly professional." "Understood." Ethan's tone remained neutral, though a flicker of amusement crossed his face. "This is about appearances. Nothing more." Mia's next words came out in a rush, surprising even herself. "And I want to continue my life as normally as possible. I don't want to be a puppet at your beck and call outside of the necessary events." He inclined his head slightly. "You'll have your autonomy, with some expected appearances, of course. I can promise that." Mia exhaled, the tension in her shoulders loosening a fraction. The weight of her decision still felt immense, but the outlines of it were starting to form into something manageable, something she could control. Okay, then I'll do it. Ethan's gaze softened, and for the first time, she thought she saw a glimmer of relief there. Good. We'll meet this evening at my office to finalize the details. Be prepared, Miss Thompson. Your life is about to change. As he stood to leave, the brief touch of his hand on hers sent an unexpected warmth through her. She watched as he walked away, the morning light catching in his hair, before she turned back toward the cafe, heart pounding. The future that awaited was uncertain, but for the first time in years, it felt different from the mundane struggle she'd come to know. It felt like the beginning of something far bigger, a leap into the unknown that could break her or lead her to a life she had only ever dreamed of. With that thought, Mia stepped back into the familiar warmth of the cafe, the reality of her decision settling around her like a shiver. The countdown to her new life had begun. The late afternoon sun bathed the Los Angeles skyline in a molten glow as Mia approached the gleaming Caldwell Enterprises building. It towered above the busy streets, an imposing monument of glass and steel that seemed to defy the very sky. The reality of what she was about to do finally struck her with full force. She hesitated at the grand revolving doors, taking a deep breath to steady herself before stepping into the world that was so far removed from her own. Inside, the lobby was a stark contrast to the cozy, chaotic cafe she was used to. The polished marble floors reflected the sleek lighting above, and voices murmured quietly over the soft hum of conversation. Mia felt out of place in her simple, neatly pressed dress, surrounded by the sharp suits and confident strides of those who moved within these walls every day. She approached the reception desk, a young woman with immaculate makeup glancing up at her with a practiced smile. "I'm here to see Ethan Caldwell," Mia said, her voice stronger than she felt. The receptionist's eyebrow twitched, but she nodded, tapping a few keys on her computer. "He's expecting you. The elevator on the right will take you to the top floor." Mia thanked her, stepping into the gleaming metal box. The elevator hummed softly as it ascended, the lights above counting up the floors at a steady pace. When the doors opened with a gentle chime, she found herself in a space that exuded power. The top floor was quieter, with floor-to-ceiling windows that showcased a breathtaking view of Los Angeles stretching toward the Pacific. The decor was modern, the furniture minimalist, with accents in deep gray and sharp black. Ethan stood at the far end of the room, engaged in a conversation with a man who looked every bit as polished and confident as him. When he noticed Mia, he nodded to the other man, who walked past her with an unreadable expression. Now, it was just the two of them. "Good evening, Miss Thompson," Ethan said, his voice smooth as he approached. He wore a charcoal suit that seemed tailored to move seamlessly with him, exuding an air of control that made Mia's palms sweat. "Evening," Mia replied, hoping the tremor in her voice wasn't as obvious as it felt. "Come, let's sit." He gestured to a pair of sleek armchairs positioned near a glass coffee table. On it lay a thick folder that Mia knew must be the contract. Mia sat, trying to ignore the view behind Ethan, the sprawling city that seemed almost infinite from up here. He opened the folder and slid a few neatly stacked papers toward her. "This is the agreement we discussed. It outlines the terms of our arrangement, public appearances, media engagements, and an agreed-upon schedule. You'll see there are provisions ensuring your autonomy, as requested." Mia picked up the first page, skimming over the formal language that spelled out her future. The salary was more than she'd expected, enough to cover her debts, move to a better apartment, and even invest in her art career. But alongside the excitement, anxiety gnawed at her. She glanced up, meeting Ethan's eyes, which were watchful but not unkind. "I'll need a day or two to go over this with someone I trust," she said, surprising herself with the firmness in her tone. Ethan nodded. "Of course. It's a significant decision. Take the time you need." The small act of understanding took Mia aback. She had expected a man like Ethan Caldwell to push, to insist on immediate answers, but instead, he seemed almost patient. "But there's one thing we should go over now," he added, leaning back in his chair. "Tomorrow night, there's a charity gala at the Rothman Art Museum. It's our first appearance as an engaged couple." Mia's heart skipped a beat. The Rothman Art Museum was a name she knew well, a place that symbolized everything she dreamed of but had never dared to imagine she could step foot in, let alone as a guest. "Tomorrow," she repeated, her voice barely concealing her nerves. "Yes, it's essential to make an immediate impact, and it will set the tone for the rest of the month. My father will be there, along with the entire board," Ethan said, studying her face. "I trust you'll be able to handle it." Mia swallowed, the weight of the task pressing on her chest. "I'll be ready." A hint of a smile played at the corner of Ethan's lips, an expression that suggested satisfaction. "Good. My driver will pick you up at 7. With the formalities settled, Mia stood, the contract clutched tightly in her hand. As she turned to leave, Ethan's voice stopped her. "Mia," he said, using her first name for the first time, "you'll be stepping into a world where every word, every glance is a weapon or an asset. People will watch you, judge you. But remember, you're here because you offer something no one else can." The unexpected encouragement lodged itself in her chest, mingling with the whirlwind of her thoughts. She nodded and left the office, the sound of her footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. That night, Mia sat at her small kitchen table, the contract spread out in front of her and Rachel seated across from her, a cup of tea in her hands. Rachel's eyes scanned the pages, her expression shifting from curious to impressed, and finally to skeptical. "This is intense," Rachel said, setting down her cup, "but it's clear he's thought of everything. Are you really sure about this, Mia?" Mia nodded slowly, her fingers tracing the edge of the paper. "I have to be. This isn't just about the money. It's a way out, a chance to do more than just scrape by." Rachel reached across the table, squeezing Mia's hand. "Then I'm here for you. But promise me you'll watch your back. Rich people don't play by the same rules as us." "I promise," Mia said, a small smile breaking the tension in her face. But as she sat alone later, after Rachel had left and the city had quieted, doubt whispered in the corners of her mind. Tomorrow night, she would step into a new life, one that could either change everything or unravel in ways she couldn't predict. Mia stood and looked at her reflection in the cracked mirror on her wall. Determined eyes stared back at her, brimming with a mix of fear and hope. For better or worse, her world was about to change. The evening of the gala arrived sooner than Mia expected. She stood in front of the full-length mirror in her small bedroom, barely recognizing the woman who stared back at her. The dress was unlike anything she had ever worn, an elegant, floor-length gown of deep sapphire blue that shimmered subtly under the light. It hugged her figure in a way that was both modest and stunning, a gift from Ethan that had arrived earlier in the day, along with a pair of silver heels that felt like walking on clouds compared to her worn sneakers. Rachel sat on the edge of Mia's bed, eyes wide with admiration. "You look like you belong on the cover of a fashion magazine," she said, a grin breaking across her face. Mia managed a nervous laugh, adjusting one of the small diamond earrings Ethan had included with the ensemble. "I feel like an imposter," she admitted, her fingers shaking as she reached for the matching clutch. Rachel stood, placing a steadying hand on Mia's arm. "You've got this, Mia. Just remember, you're stronger than any of them know." Before Mia could respond, a honk from outside startled her. She peered out the window to see a sleek black limousine idling by the curb, its polished exterior gleaming under the streetlights. Her heart hammered as she descended the narrow stairwell of her building, the clatter of her heels echoing in the enclosed space. The driver opened the door with a courteous nod, and Mia slid into the plush interior, the scent of leather and faint cologne enveloping her. Ethan sat across from her, dressed impeccably in a black tuxedo, his expression unreadable. For a moment, silence settled between them, punctuated only by the quiet hum of the engine as the car pulled away. "You look perfect," Ethan said, finally breaking the silence. His eyes scanned her with an approving gleam. "Thank you," Mia replied, her voice steadier than she felt. The compliment felt professional, detached, but it still sent a ripple of warmth through her. He leaned forward slightly, a serious expression replacing the polite smile. "Tonight, everyone will be watching us. My father, the board members, investors, all of them. We need to be convincing." Mia nodded, gripping the clutch in her lap tighter. I understand. I've read the background notes you sent me. Good, Ethan said, a brief flicker of relief crossing his features. He leaned back, the tension in his posture easing a fraction. Just be yourself, but remember, we're a couple in love. You'll need to hold my arm, smile, laugh when it feels right. The simplicity of his instructions felt deceptive, but Mia met his eyes with a calm she didn't quite feel. Understood. As they approached the Rothman Art Museum, Mia's breath caught in her throat. The grand entrance was a spectacle of lights and glamour, with rows of expensive cars pulling up to let out elegantly dressed guests. Paparazzi cameras flashed in rapid succession, catching every smile, every perfectly posed moment. The driver opened the door, and Ethan stepped out first, extending a hand to Mia. She hesitated for a fraction of a second before placing her hand in his, allowing him to help her out. The warmth of his touch was reassuring, grounding her in the moment. As she stood beside him, the collective attention of dozens of eyes landed on them. Whispers rippled through the crowd as they made their way up the carpeted steps. Mia's heart raced with the knowledge that this was not her world. The air felt different, charged with expectations she didn't fully understand. But Ethan's calm presence anchored her, and she lifted her chin, mustering a smile as they walked into the grand foyer of the museum. The interior was breathtaking. Crystal chandeliers hung from high vaulted ceilings, casting shimmering patterns across marble floors. The room was filled with men in tuxedos and women in gowns as dazzling as Mia's, each drink and conversation a carefully measured display of elegance. Charles Caldwell, Ethan's father, stood near the center of the room, surrounded by a small group of influential guests. Even in his late 60s, he was an imposing figure, his silver hair swept back and eyes sharp behind wire-rimmed glasses. His gaze met Ethan's, then shifted to Mia, scrutinizing her with an intensity that made her spine stiffen. "Ethan, you've finally arrived," Charles said as they approached, his voice deep and commanding. His eyes lingered on Mia for a moment longer, a slight arch of an eyebrow betraying his curiosity. "And this must be Mia." "Yes, father," Ethan said smoothly, his arm tightening around Mia's waist in a gesture that felt natural but deliberate. "Mia, this is my father, Charles Caldwell." "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mr. Caldwell," Mia said, extending her hand. The older man's handshake was firm, his eyes narrowing slightly as he took in her poise. "The pleasure is mine," Charles replied, though his tone suggested the jury was still out on that. He shifted his attention back to the group around him, making polite introductions to several members of the board and their spouses. Mia smiled, nodded, and played her part, exchanging pleasantries as the room continued to buzz with conversation. As the evening progressed, Mia found herself moving fluidly through conversations, the initial tremor of anxiety in her stomach morphing into something almost exhilarating. Ethan remained close by, his presence both a reminder of the stakes and a strange source of comfort. At one point, an older woman with an elaborate necklace leaned in and whispered, "You're quite the breath of fresh air, dear. Ethan has needed someone like you for some time." Mia's smile faltered for just a heartbeat, but she recovered quickly. "Thank you. I'm lucky to have him," she said, casting a sidelong glance at Ethan, who met her eyes with an unreadable expression. A soft chime echoed through the room, signaling the start of a brief address by Charles. He stepped to the center, raising a glass, and the murmurs quieted. His eyes swept the crowd, landing on Mia and Ethan as he spoke. "Thank you all for being here tonight, supporting the arts and the community that defines the city," Charles began. His voice was strong, commanding attention effortlessly. "As we look to the future of Caldwell Enterprises, it's reassuring to see that leadership remains steady, with integrity and with support." His eyes flickered to Ethan once more, the subtext clear. "We are in good hands." The room erupted in polite applause, and Ethan's hand brushed against Mia's. She turned her head slightly, catching the subtle softening in his gaze. For the briefest moment, everything else faded. The murmur of the guests, the blinding lights, and she felt an inexplicable shift between them. But before she could process it, the clink of glasses and resumed conversations broke the spell. Ethan's demeanor shifted back to his usual guarded expression as he nodded toward a group of investors approaching them. Mia smiled and prepared to play her role once more, silently reminding herself that this was just the beginning of their charade. Yet, deep down, she couldn't ignore the way her heart had begun to betray her, inch by inch, with every glance and touch that passed between them. The night air outside the Rothman Art Museum was cool and tinged with the faint scent of jasmine from the surrounding gardens. The glow of the city lights painted the sky in shades of gold and deep blue as the gala began to wind down. Inside, the room was still buzzing with energy, filled with laughter and the clinking of glasses. Conversations mingled with the soft notes of a string quartet in the corner, creating a backdrop of cultivated elegance. Mia stood by a tall glass window, taking a moment to catch her breath. The night had gone better than she'd expected. She had managed to weave through conversations with board members and investors with only a few slips. The reactions ranged from polite curiosity to sincere approval, and the occasional sidelong glance that hinted at skepticism. Still, her nerves had settled into a manageable hum as the evening wore on, thanks in part to Ethan's reassuring presence beside her. Mia felt a wave of relief wash over her as Charles walked away, leaving her standing alone for a moment before Ethan returned to her side. "What did he say?" Ethan asked, his voice tight with a mix of curiosity and concern. Mia looked up at him, the city lights reflected in her eyes. "He wanted to know why I'm here. Why you, specifically, and what did you tell him?" Ethan's gaze searched hers. The question weighted with something more than casual interest. "I told him the truth," Mia replied, a smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "That you're different, and that you make me feel like I can be part of something bigger." Ethan's eyes softened, the guarded lines of his face relaxing. "You said that?" His voice was quieter, as though he needed to hear it again to believe it. "Yes," Mia whispered, the space between them charged with an unspoken understanding. The crowd around them seemed to fade, their polished conversations and bright laughter receding into the background. For the first time, Mia felt as though they were not acting, not just performing a role. The moment stretched, fragile and real, until Ethan took a step back, the subtle tension broken. "We should make our rounds before we leave," he said, the professional mask sliding back into place. But something in his eyes lingered, a question left unanswered. The drive home was quieter, the hum of the city muted as the limousine glided through the streets. Ethan sat across from Mia, the distance between them filled with unsaid words. She could feel his gaze on her from time to time, but he said nothing, keeping his attention on the passing cityscape. Mia's thoughts churned. She replayed every conversation, every expression from the night, trying to make sense of the shift between them. The logical part of her knew this was a game, an arrangement meant to serve a purpose and then end. But the way Ethan had looked at her tonight, the unguarded moments where his touch had lingered just a bit too long, were making it harder to remember that. When the car finally pulled up outside her apartment building, Ethan got out first, walking around to open her door himself. The gesture, though small, felt personal in a way that made Mia's heart clench. "Thank you for tonight," Ethan said, his voice soft as he held her gaze. "You were incredible." Mia stepped out, her heels clicking against the pavement. "So were you," she said, her words carrying more weight than she intended. They stood close, the night wrapping around them, quiet and full of possibility. For a moment, it seemed as if Ethan was about to say something more, but instead, he gave a brief nod and stepped back. Mia took a deep breath and turned toward her building, the chill of the night air brushing her skin. As she walked inside, the distant roar of the city seemed to echo her own thoughts, full of contradictions, questions, and a feeling that this was only the beginning of something neither of them could fully control. The weeks passed in a blur of events, meetings, and carefully crafted public appearances. Mia moved through it all with a surprising sense of calm, having grown accustomed to the way eyes followed her wherever she went. Ethan remained by her side, the perfect partner in this strange dance of pretense and public scrutiny. But as the month drew to a close, Mia couldn't shake the feeling that their arrangement was building to something beyond either of their control. The last event was a grand dinner hosted by Caldwell Enterprises, a celebration of a new partnership that would propel the company into its next chapter. It was the perfect culmination, and everyone who mattered would be there. Investors, board members, and, most importantly, Charles Caldwell. This would be the night that solidified Ethan's place as the new CEO. Mia stood in front of the mirror in the guest suite of Ethan's penthouse, adjusting the elegant emerald green gown she'd chosen for the evening. The fabric shimmered under the soft lighting, making her feel powerful and exposed all at once. She took a deep breath, willing her racing heart to slow. This was supposed to be just one more night, one more act in the story they'd written together. But why did it feel so final, like an ending she wasn't ready for? A knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. Ethan stepped into the room, looking as impeccably put together as ever in a tailored black suit. His eyes met hers, and for a moment, the mask he wore slipped. There was a tension in his gaze that mirrored her own uncertainty. "You look beautiful," he said, his voice quieter than usual. There was a note of hesitation, as though he wanted to say more but was holding back. "Thank you," Mia replied, managing a small smile. "Ready for tonight?" He nodded, stepping closer. "As ready as I'll ever be." Ethan paused, searching her face. "Mia, after tonight, when this is all over, I want you to know that what we've done, it wasn't just an act for me. Not anymore." Mia's breath caught in her throat. The vulnerability in his eyes made her feel as though the room had shrunk, leaving only the two of them standing in the middle of a moment that was raw and real. She opened her mouth to respond, but before she could speak, Ethan's phone buzzed. The spell broke, and he stepped back, the familiar mask of control slipping back into place. "It's time. We should go," he said, his voice neutral once more. The ride to the venue was quiet, tension stretching between them. The banquet hall was a sea of lights, crystal chandeliers casting a warm glow over the opulent space. Guests mingled, their laughter and conversation blending into a soft hum. Mia and Ethan entered arm in arm, their smiles practiced but their minds elsewhere. Charles Caldwell approached them early in the evening, his expression carefully neutral. "Ethan, Mia," he greeted them with a nod. His eyes, however, lingered on his son, as if searching for signs of weakness or resolve. "Tonight is an important milestone." "Yes, father," Ethan said, the words clipped but respectful. Mia watched as Charles shifted his gaze to her, the sharpness in his eyes softening for just a moment. "You've surprised me," Charles said, addressing her. "You've brought out something in him I wasn't sure was there." Mia's smile wavered, unsure how to respond, but Ethan's hand at her waist tightened ever so slightly, grounding her. "It's been an honor to be part of this," she said, hoping the sincerity in her voice would mask the conflict brewing inside her. As the evening went on, speeches were made, toasts were given, and applause echoed through the grand hall. Ethan stood at the podium, the spotlight illuminating him as he spoke about the future of Caldwell Enterprises. Mia watched, her heart twisting with a blend of pride and an ache she couldn't name. This was the moment he'd been fighting for, the moment they'd built together. But where did that leave her? When the speech ended to a round of applause, Ethan's eyes found hers across the room. Something unspoken passed between them, a question, a plea, a hope. The final moments of the evening blurred together until Mia found herself on the balcony, the cool night air brushing against her skin. The city below was alive with lights and motion, oblivious to the storm inside her. She heard footsteps behind her and turned to see Ethan. "I needed a moment," she said, before he could speak. "So did I," Ethan admitted, stepping up beside her. They stood in silence, the sounds of the party behind them a distant hum. "Ethan, I don't know what happens next," Mia whispered, looking out over the city. "I didn't think it would be this hard to let go." He turned to her, eyes dark with intensity. "What if you didn't have to?" The words hung between them, heavy with meaning. This started as a lie, a convenience. But somewhere along the way, it became real. At least for me. Mia's heart raced, the confession hanging in the air between them. "It became real for me too," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan took her hands, turning her to face him fully. "Then let's rewrite this story, Mia. No more pretending. Just us. Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes, a mixture of relief and disbelief washing over her. She nodded, unable to find the right words. Ethan's face broke into a smile, rare and genuine, before he pulled her into an embrace that felt like coming home. The sounds of the city and the distant laughter from inside faded away as they stood together under the starlit sky. For the first time, there was no pretense, no script, just two people who had found something real in the most unexpected place. Mia knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. And as she looked up at Ethan, the man who had become so much more than a business deal, she felt the hope of a new beginning take root in her heart.